and it strikes me looking out at you now that a lot of you are terrifyingly young and may not even remember what it was like to live in the last months of 1989, or not remember it very clearly. But for those of us of my age, and even quite a lot younger, the sense of human emancipation that occurred with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the implosion of the ossified form of Russo-communism that had been imposed on Eastern and Baltic Europe, and some of Balkan Europe, that sense is something I can still very vividly call to mind. I was in Romania at the time it actually happened, watching the overthrow of the Ceausescu regime, which was perhaps the most brutal and corrupt, as well as the most, the one that was most centered on a cult of personality. And it wasn't just that it was extraordinary to see so many millions of people in so many different countries and societies simply by folding their arms and adopting an attitude of defiance, revolutionizing and changing their system. It wasn't that it was so moving to see that. It was the realization that the Cold War was over in the other way too. That it was quite likely now that we would not have to think every day of the possibility of a mistake or a crime or a blunder leading to what was euphemistically called in my hometown of Washington, D.C., a nuclear exchange. Imagine thinking of a thermonuclear holocaust as an exchange, but that was the way we tried to make the thought go away. It was an extraordinary period. And in those days, some of you will remember, and you can look it up, there was talk of a peace dividend, of the possibility of transferring the enormous resources that we've been putting into warfare into peaceful projects and into doing something about the real victims of the Cold War, who were the inhabitants of the countries we used to call the Third World. That there would be possibly a new internationalism, a new comity internationally, a new renunciation of force, some spare money, and a common feeling that the values of pluralism and democracy were worth having for their own sake, and had, so to speak, proved their worth in ideological combat against both fascism and Stalinism. It was a blissful time to be around, I tell you. That's November the 9th, call it. That's the day the Berlin Wall fell. Ceausescu fell actually not till Christmas Day, or Christmas Eve in Bucharest. So that's the end of 1989. The 2nd of August, 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Actually, it's not really strictly true to say that he invaded Kuwait, he annexed Kuwait. He announced that Kuwait was part of Iraq. He did something that had never been tried before, abolished the existence of a member state of the United Nations, a fellow Muslim state, and member of the Arab League. Quite an extraordinary thing to have done. And around that time, Slobodan Milosevic tried to impose the idea of a national socialist, Greater Serbia, on his neighbors in first Slovenia, then Croatia, then most heinously in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then in Kosovo. And suddenly it hit me. I shouldn't have been part of this naive chorus about the end of history and the peace dividend. I had some reservations about it, which I published, but I had shared in the general optimism. Of course we were not yet out from under the rule or the danger that is posed by psychopathic dictatorship. So I had to spend a lot of time, first in northern Iraq, in Kurdistan, and then in Sarajevo and Mostar, witnessing what happens when dictators are allowed to get their way. And the shameful thought that one had about it was that in both cases, the cases of Saddam Hussein and Slobodan Milosevic, they had been allowed to get away with the impression that they were thought of by Western democratic societies as allies, even sometimes as clients, or if one couldn't go quite that far, as necessary partners for negotiation. And in fact, Milosevic, I remember being called by the Clinton administration a partner in peace. And I began to evolve the following view of it. Coexistence with psychopathic dictatorships is in fact not possible. And that is a good thing, probably, because nor is it desirable. 2 or 3 years after Milosevic had been called a partner in peace at Dayton, one of his other conditions, as well as not being arrested, was that the name Kosovo not be mentioned in any of the conversations, that the subject not be brought up. That was acceded to as well by an administration so eager to declare a peaceful victory. In all the years that were spent in trying to contain, or even to coerce, or to civilize or domesticate this man had been wasted. They had in fact all been exploited by him to advance his program of his mad idea of a greater Serbia. And the same had been true every time people had ever tried to make nice with Saddam Hussein. It seemed that his appetite for power only grew with the eating.
A week ago, Russia proceeded with its agreement with Iran to provide them with enriched uranium. They're also supplying mid-range missiles to Syria. And this is all following a brief meeting with the president about 2 weeks ago in Europe. There's criticism on both sides of the aisle that the president blinked during this meeting. And I was hoping to gauge your thought and opinion on where is the U.S. relation, where are the U.S. relations heading with Russia, particularly with respect to the Middle East, and what are we essentially looking at? Are we again looking at a stare down with Russia, or do you hope that the situation will come around because the sentiment for democracy is too great?
The stupidest thing that I think that George Bush has ever said, some might laugh at this point and say, how long are you going to go on before you pick one? But actually, I think he said many quite shrewd things, including about the axis of evil. After all, think what we've been talking about just now. Who says he wasn't right to say that was an axis of evil? Nobody says that now. Everything we find out about those countries is much worse than what we thought, for most people to find out anyway. However, I should say the stupidest thing the president said was as soon as he saw that Vladimir Putin was wearing a crucifix around his neck, he knew he was a man who could be trusted. I have garlic under this, in case you're wondering. And he looked him in the eye and he knew he was a great man. And, I mean, I thought, oh God. So that really is what you get if you're faith-based. You get a KGB weasel as your partner. And it's too late to say that you think he's no good after you've endorsed him in that manner. Now, since that time, Mr. Putin intervened outrageously in the attempt of the people of Ukraine to make a self-determined government of their own. I do not believe, I say it flatly, I do not believe anyone in the Ukrainian KGB would have dared to try to poison the opposition leader if they thought the Russians didn't know or might disapprove. It is not possible in that milieu for the approval of Putin, at least negatively, not to have been sought. And I think that question should be asked much more aggressively than it has been. Mr. Putin's policy of unilateralism in respect of Iraq at the United Nations, putting Russian interest, or the interest actually of a clan of former Soviet mobsters who are owed a lot of money by Saddam's regime and who were trading on the oil for food program, which is largely run through Russia, was scandalous. That's unilateralism at the UN, not what the United States was doing, which was trying to get the existing resolutions enforced. And yes, now Syria and now Iran. And they're very unhelpful about North Korea too, and dragging their feet on an agreement we've had for a long time. I'm sorry I keep saying we. I was in America this morning and I'll be there again tomorrow. You'll pardon that. To build down the existing nuclear stocks, a lot of which are still targeted and still in the silos. That should have been done years ago, and it hasn't been. And this is to say nothing about how he doesn't let the Russians interfere in their own internal affairs, which he does not. I mean, he's quite clearly embarked on a course of one man and one party rule for his own country. So this is extremely dangerous. And it shows that there has been a great Russian chauvinist resentment ever since the events of 1989, the feeling that they are on the losing side and that they're becoming a victim country. This, I think, is incalculably dangerous.